I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, we're doing the Lu Xun series, but it's the first guest we have on the podcast for this series. And boy, do we have a big name today.
Yeah, what a guest. Professor Theodore Huters of UCLA. Professor Huters has been in the game a long time. If you are involved in China studies at all, you've likely read something he's written. For my own doctoral dissertation, his book, Bringing the World Home, was a huge, huge reference work. He has written about a ton of stuff. I would give you a summary, but whatever summary I give would feel...
We don't have that much time.
A little slighting, yes. Suffice to say, he's been in the game a long time. Welcome, Professor Huters.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
And we'll just go ahead and jump into the piece itself that Professor Huters has selected to talk about today, because I have a feeling we're going to be talking quite a bit. Professor Huters, the piece we're talking about is variously translated Refutation of Malevolent Voices. Most of our listeners, unless they're China specialists, likely will not have heard this. So if you wouldn't mind, could you tell everybody roughly where in Lu Xun's life and career this is being written? And if it's possible to summarize it briefly, if you could do that as well.
He wrote 4 important essays, all published in the same journal in 1907, 1908. The journal was Henan, which was a revolutionary publication of the Henan Students Association. And the journal was shut down by the Japanese authorities shortly after the final essay was published, which is on the refutation of malevolent voices. Well, I'll talk about 2 of the other important essays. One is on Mara poetry, Mo Shi Li Shuo, and the other is concerning imbalanced cultural development, Wenhua Pianzhi Luan. All 3 of them are very important. There's another one on history, which I won't talk about. But these were all written about the same time, and they're all very important. And they have a lot of thematic common ground to them. One of the things that separates them is they're all written in a very dense, archaic style, which was fashionable among a certain faction of the intellectuals at the time, notably Yan Fu and Zhang Taiyan. Zhang Taiyan, or Zhang Binglin, was a philologist who was often called Lu Xun's teacher, but whether he was his teacher or not, strictly speaking, he was certainly influential, certainly on Lu Xun's writing style at the time, which is very dense and hard to understand. Now, Mara poetry and cultural development, imbalanced cultural development, are hard enough to read on their own. They're also difficult. But Malevolent Voices is a whole different level of difficulty. One of the things is, at the end of Malevolent Voices, it's written in Chinese Weiwan. It's unfinished. Would mean there's more to come, or he hasn't fully revised it. And frankly, I have a hard time deciding which is which. The conventional wisdom is that there was more to come. But given the kind of randomness at times in the essay, compared to the other 2 essays, which are much more coherent developmentally, I suspect it also might be that he didn't get around to ever revising it. It's it introduces some new things that aren't in the earlier 2 essays. Basically, all the essays share an objection to mass culture. Mass culture being stifling the true voice, or the voice of the heart, 心声, which is a term he used in all 3 of the essays, which means the authentic voice that is being stifled by the mass voice, which sort of puts the individual voice down and doesn't let it express itself freely. So he sets up a apparent contradiction. He says there's a cacophony of all of these voices, but since it's all a kind of mass voice, it amounts to a deep silence. So the theme of silent China, which is something that appears throughout his career, is set out here first in all 3 of these essays. The difference between the earlier 2 and the Malevolent Voices is, in the earlier 2, he's essentially talking to Western ideas that are coming to China. On the Mara poetry, he's addressing the way in which writing can deal with this problem of inauthentic voices. In Unbalanced Development, he's talking about the philosophical basis of how this mass voice is overcome. So the first two essays are basically addressing the Western ideas and writing styles that are coming in. And he says, mass culture has afflicted the West before it's afflicted us. It will get to us. And in fact, it already has, and we have to reject it. So he's very opposed to the materialism that he sees growing out of 19th century Europe and being expanded into China. One of his most famous lines in Mara poetry is, all we've learned from the West is how to bake cakes and design prisons. Now, the difference in Malevolent Voices is that he's really not addressing the Western ideas here at all. In fact, he's pretty much saying we don't want them, more or less, although not, in so many words. And he's trying to find sources for authenticity within the Chinese tradition. And what he advocates is basically popular mythology, which he spends a lot of time saying everybody else regards this as superstition, which has to be overcome. We know this from Weber. Weber calls it disenchantment, which is part of the rationality of the modern. Lu Xun, if anything, is advocating re-enchantment of using mythology and folktales and the folk tradition of creativity in the face of things that people can't really understand. So it's a creative way of trying to understand the world. And he says China, everybody says China has no religion, but he says actually China is more religious than other countries because of the kind of animism that exists in China. In fact, he says everything in China has a religious side to it. Everything is alive. And so we should take advantage of that and be creative. I think you can see how this is influential in his later writing. The prose poems, or whatever you want to call them, in Yecao or Wild Grasses, very much plug into this kind of phantasmagoric thing that he has given a reason for existing in Malevolent Voices. Okay, so that's a basic thing. And the real thing that separates this essay from the others is he's no longer sort of trying to justify things from the West, talking on the sort of Western standard of ideas, but he's trying to be as indigenous as possible. The other thing is he at the time, writing in the vernacular, serious ideas was just off the table. It was not even to be considered. If you wanted to write serious, you had to write in classical Chinese. But his classical Chinese is different. He says the ordinary run of classical Chinese post-Song dynasty, i.e. for the last 1,000 years of Chinese history, is debased and not truly able to express ideas and thoughts. Only if we go back to archaic Chinese, pre-Song, ideally pre-Han, do we find the sources for authenticity there. So that's something he very much shares with Zhang Taiyan and with Yan Fu, who pretty much said the same thing a little earlier than that. So we can say he was perhaps influenced by them in that take. And so the style that results is this incredibly difficult, and you have to spend, even Chinese scholars and Chinese departments in China admit that this is difficult. So as a result, it hasn't been studied very much, partly because it's not particularly well organized, and also it's really difficult to read and sort of hard to interpret. But one more word on the style. Lu Xun shared with Yan Fu and Zhang Taiyan the notion that style is part of the message of the writing. You can't abstract style from the content of the writing. And this is very much part of the Chinese tradition, at least in the 19th and 18th, 19th. The Tongzheng school said style was really important in getting the ideas across. So it wasn't unique to them. It was common among all writers in China that you had to have a kind of an aesthetic tuning to your writing to be able to make it real. This is in marked contrast to May 4th, which was focused, strictly speaking, on getting the idea across and cutting any extraneous stylistic flourishes. Real difference. And one of the things I was thinking yesterday, Hu Shi's early poetry has always struck me as being absolutely abominable, as unpoetic as it's possible for poetry to be. Basically, because he disallowed any embellishment of the language, you're left with trying to make a silk purse out of a sow's ear with this sort of basic, sort of vernacular language.
Two questions. You mentioned that he's kind of rejecting both mass culture and the West. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a bit more to that, because when I was reading this, I definitely agree to you to a certain degree. He is rejecting mass culture, but it's a very specific kind of mass culture. Like his understanding of masses, at least as I'm reading this, doesn't include like the peasants. He's saying that peasants have preserve this mythological Chinese identity. I don't want to use that term because I know it's loaded, but it does seem like it almost seems like a sort of bourgeoisie mass culture that he's rejecting. Am I right in that?
I think you're very much correct on that. There's a slight contradiction there, because one of the things he says is that if somebody stands up and tries to have an individual authentic voice, he'll be put down by the mobilization of the masses against him. So to a certain extent, he's looking at the fact that there's a sort of top-downness to this, well, call it bourgeois culture or the remnants of gentry culture, whatever it is that's enforcing this conformity. It has the capacity to move into the masses. So it's a moot point, really, because he doesn't develop that per se. But you're certainly right that this creativity exists at least implicitly among the masses in their response to things. And we can tune into that tradition to our benefit. And I guess in the story, you see this most clearly in Guxiang, or my old home, where Runtu, the peasant boy who'd been his friend, is the repository of all good things about nature and all ideas and everything creative. Whereas Lu Xun says we were surrounded by four walls and all we could see was the empty sky above us. So, I mean, that's very much part of this Malevolent Voices implicitly there. Although it's interesting, he doesn't develop it as systematically as he might have to deal with what you're talking about.
This is an interesting piece for when it occurs. We've talked about themes with rejecting mass culture, bourgeois mass culture in particular. Lu Xun is coming up on the end of his time in Japan. He's also, to some extent, if you've read enough of his work, coming towards the end of a certain perspective on what literature is and what it can do. I mean, famously in his preface to Nahan, he talks about spending a lot of time not writing anything because pretty much just forget about it. I gave that a shot. It didn't work. This is coming at the just about right when that breaking point happens, right? This is his last salvo. What's striking about it is how deeply influenced by Nietzsche it is. If you've read any Nietzsche, you can see it in just about every line in this one in particular, this emphasis on the individual speaking from his heart and not relying on anyone around him to verify it. And I'm curious, because for Nietzsche, you always wonder if it is more important just to say something individually or if it's important to say something important, right? So is it more important how it's said or what it's said? And with Lu Xun here, you see a lot of mentions of the individual, the individual, the individual. Very few mentions about what exactly the individual is to do. So when you read this, do you see Lu Xun emphasizing more the individuality or what the individual is specifically supposed to do or say?
The premise of what you're saying is it sort of assumes that there's a way of dividing those two things. Given the Chinese literary tradition, the way you say it and what you say can't really be separated. So I think Lu Xun is assuming that's the case. I mean, because that's where he's coming from, and he doesn't examine that and say, no, that's not right. So I mean, and the style that he develops is very much part of this expression that he wants to develop. And he says in the essay, he says, once we have authentic voices, it will have the power to get us out of our mire. He doesn't say how, he just says it will enable that to happen. So it's both how he goes about saying it and the content that's involved in that. So, and I think it's really important to understand, given the context and given what Lu Xun says, you can't really separate those two things. Whereas you may be able to do it in Nietzsche because in the West it's more easy to separate. But I'm not sure that can be done. That comes later in the May 4th. And what May 4th does is, attempting to excise all of this sort of literary flourish, that what they regard as superfluous literary flourish, and Lu Xun, Yan Fu, and Zhang Tan regard as being absolutely essential to the Xin Da Ya, as Yan Fu called it. Xin is being faithful to the text, Da is getting your point communicated, and everybody's wondered about Ya. And most people in the 20th century says it's pure decoration. Well, it's not. It's the essence of the subjectivity that you find in your writing style that's able to get it across. May 4th people don't understand the third of that trio of Yan Fu, the Ya part, and they just say, oh, it's pure decoration to sort of kiss the behinds of the educated people, which really isn't true. I really take it. I mean, I gave a paper on Yan Fu at AAS at the Association for Asian Studies in 70s. Isn't it? He's just trying to get in good with the old guys. I said, no, that's a really stupid way of looking at it. He really meant what he was doing. Can't we give him credit for that? And so that's a very May 4th sort of take on it.
So I had another question. You've talked a lot about style and how that is a core component of this essay. How does that manifest itself in the May 4th in terms of Lu Xun's career and the May 4th? I mean, Lu Xun, his style is so different in the May 4th compared with this. This felt much more like an eight-legged essay. But, style is incredibly important, particularly when you think about the sort of questions of epistemology on Diary of a Madman, Quangren Reji, the question of the preface at the beginning, which is written in Wenyan Wen, versus the body of the diary, which is written in Baihua. How does these questions of style that we're seeing in this essay play out in the rest of Lu Xun's career?
I think it's always there. He's reluctant to go into it, I would think. But once in the early 1930s, in the essay on one of the essays on hard translation, he says, people ask me why I write. What's your purpose in writing this? And he says, I write it for myself. And anybody who can understand it, it's up to the reader. It's not up to me. So in other words, that style is consistent throughout his oeuvre. And the thing about mentioning Diary of a Madman, it always strikes us that the introduction in classical Chinese is the hard part, whereas the vernacular is the easy part. For the readers at the time, it was the opposite. You have to consider that's the possibility, because what he writes, the introduction is very standard classical Chinese, unlike Malevolent Voices. It's very standard, very ordinary demotic classical Chinese, the kind of stuff that he's denouncing in Voices. Whereas the vernacular is highly complicated and hard to understand. When I teach it in Chinese to native speakers of Chinese, they're always misinterpreting the vernacular lines because they don't know how to read them, because it's hard. So there's a stylistic density even in his early vernacular that we're often sort of blind to, but I think it's very much there.
I'm curious, a lot of times in this piece, not a lot of times, the whole piece is dedicated to this, talking about China. But what China is he talking about exactly? I mean, I can't help thinking of Nietzsche again, but Nietzsche loathed the government, loathed governments telling people what to do. And so for him, any nation can't possibly be defined by its government. So I have to assume something is at work here with Lu Xun, but he seems to be taking such a hard line against other political entities that I can't help wonder, is he defining China by the Chinese state, or is it something bigger than that?
Yeah, I think it's something bigger than that. I think it's basically tianxia, the realm, or all under heaven. And what's interesting is he doesn't spend much time in any of these essays denouncing the government per se. Everybody else at the time is very delighted to jump on the government and say how incompetent they are. Lu Xun doesn't waste his time, doesn't spend time on that. I think he regards the problem as deeper than that. The government is a kind of epiphenomenon in this, and that really the problem is a core problem of the sort of popular mentality, or the elite whatever. It's the sort of the people who run the place and their way of thinking that's the problem. And the government is, well, we can take care of that when we need to.
I actually had a question about that because I was surprised. I kept expecting him to say something about the Qing dynasty. He's evoking this sense of nation. Nation is a very important part of this essay. And there was one point, I think, on the first 2 pages of the translation we were using, I expected him to kind of go into that, but then he completely ducks it. Why do you think he's not dealing with this?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think I more or less said what I think about it in my last comment, that it's not, the government is not really of a concern here. Now, what's interesting, Wang Hui, I don't know if you're using the public, it was published in Boundary 2 in 2011.
Yeah.
And the translation by John Kowal is very good.
Yeah, that's what we're using. Mm-hmm.
He's translated the other two essays too, but they haven't been published yet for reasons that I still don't understand. I mean, if you need some, I have them. If you want them, I'll email them to you. They're equally good. But Wang Hui, in the essay that we translated to accompany the essay, says something that, Lu Xun is motivated by anti-Manchu feeling. And I don't see it. It's something I disagree with, because anti-Manchu feeling was pretty easy to express, and was often expressed even by people like Zhang Taiyan and his so-called teacher. But I just don't see it, emphasized in this essay, or in the other two essays for that matter. I mean, it was something he was concerned with, bigger fish to fry than the government, ironically, which is not the way most people saw it.
He's definitely concerned with something other than the government, but at this point, the question of government is implicated or connected with this question of ethnicity, and he doesn't touch that at all, even though it's all about this question of nation.
Right. He doesn't. I mean, it's very, it's completely open. I mean, so you could say he's like, Xi Jinping, everybody who lives in China is Chinese. Or, he's only looking at the Han people and he wants to abolish them. He doesn't tell you. He just doesn't go into it. So there's no answer to it. I mean, you just have to, you can sort of throw your own opinions in there and try to bend it that way, but the text doesn't help you out in that respect.
Yeah.
So.
Leading off of that, this is not as big a question, but I'm really curious what you make of this. Twice, at least so far as I can remember from the text, he brings up the Yellow Emperor in what appears to be a very approving fashion. I think at one point he uses the phrase "sons of the Yellow Emperor," and at some point, I'm just going to parse this basically that the Yellow Emperor is turning in his grave right now. Some version of that, like, look what we're doing. Look, the Yellow Emperor would be horrified or something. Is he using this purely as a kind of literary device, or do you see a real sympathy with, or possibly even approval of, the Yellow Emperor? That's not a very common thing to express in this era, at least in terms of reformers.
No, sir, and even more so after May 4th. I think basically the way I would look at it is, for him, the Yellow Emperor is part of this mythological base that he sees as a source of creativity. He would see it as a product of this, popular imagination that he's very much approving of. So he's not going to condemn anything in that category. And the Yellow Emperor, is a convenient marker for this popular creativity that he's trying to promote here, which is the real core point of this essay compared to the other two important. One thing I'd like to say before, I would say that this is a profoundly modernist essay. And I'll give you 3 readings. If one of modernism's features is a critique of ordinary modernity, then this essay is right there. 2, if modernism distressed the repositional power of ordinary language, this essay is right there too. 3, if modernism is built on the notion of the future as the as yet unknown, this is there too, because he doesn't predict anything that's going to happen. Whereas most Chinese after May 4th, the modern is known because it's the modern that's been pioneered by the West. And that's also what separates this essay from the earlier two, from Mara and Imbalanced Development, which you could say, yes, he's looking at the West as the future. That's going to happen. He's rejecting it mostly, but he's seeing it as the future. Whereas in this essay, in Malevolent Voices, he doesn't do that at all. He just gets away from that. And he says, look to these creative springs that we have to develop on our own, and forget, the West is not, we can use it for its own purposes, but we can't sort of follow in its footsteps. So, it fits sort of a whole bunch of possible categories of what one would think of as modernism. And modernism is pretty rare in modern China, basically. So.
Can I ask, so it's funny that you should say that, because with this series, one of the things we're trying to argue is that Lu Xun has not been read enough as a modernist writer, a part of the global modernism movement. Why do you think that is, though? Why is he not alongside Joyce and Proust and Kafka in the sort of modernist pantheon?
Partly it's because, Western sinology still takes its cues from Chinese scholarship. And Chinese scholarship, generally speaking, has sort of pushed modernism aside, or did up until, say, 1980. And then when we decided that modernism was a thing, we looked at the people who call themselves modernists, like the Xinganjue Pai, the new sensationalist school. And Lu Xun just sort of got, because he was adopted as a critical realist, part of the Marxist tradition, all that, he was overlooked for that reason. It's pretty much political. It was just an overlooked, basically. And I think people have come back to it now. Andrew Jones is certainly open to looking at it, looks at him as a modernist.
When I went to Taiwan and studied Lu Xun, I was surprised by how few people there think of Lu Xun in terms of modernism. I'm not sure if I was right in this, but I was expecting Taiwanese scholars to think more of Lu Xun as a modernist writer. I
think you're correct. I think Lu Xun is, for a whole bunch of reasons, because he's too critical of China, he's part of the communist, blah, 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 whatever. There's people, generally speaking, that generation of intellectuals in Taiwan do not like Lu Xun. There's very complicated reasons for it. And so, in other words, when it comes to taking him as a modernist, he's just, out beyond the pale.
I think to a certain degree, a lot of those Taiwanese scholars are deriving that from C.T. Xia.
Yeah, I think Xia, he tries as much as possible to devalue it. Yeah. But what's interesting about C.T. is actually he's a pretty good reader of literature. So he can't completely get away with it in good conscience. So he has to give Lu Xun some credit.
One of the big questions I have when I read this, knowing when it's written in Lu Xun's career, when it's coming right on the cusp of him basically saying, forget about it, I'm just going to go teach and just, it's not worth it, is whether or not this great individual, this great person writing from the heart, that's sort of the focus of this essay, is meant to be him, if he's saying, I'm going to be that person, or if he's reaching the end of that kind of enthusiasm and he's actually saying, it's probably going to have to be somebody else. So do you see Lu Xun writing him into this narrative or writing himself out of this narrative?
I don't think he's writing himself out. The diminution of enthusiasm, it may be because of his change of jobs, and it may be because of his disappointment with the revolution 3 years later. It's really hard to say, and I think probably both of those are involved. And what's interesting, I don't think he starts to question the subjective voice until you get to short stories like Zhufu and Lai Jiulou Shang, where the whole point is to question the narrator and the standpoint of the narrator's speaking position. He doesn't really do that before then. Diary of a Madman, the madman is crazy, but still he's trying to speak the truth and he's suppressed. So Diary of a Madman fits pretty well into these early essays as somebody who's trying to create and being suppressed by the mass silence around him, or the noisy silence around him.
So my last question is, we've talked a little bit about Lu Xun and his relationship to the West and what he sees as the relationship to the West. We haven't really mentioned the rest. That is, this essay talks some about the West, but it also talks about Poland and India. And it's interesting because he's constructing this sort of China as the equivalent of this, what we would today call the global South. I don't know if you can fit Poland into the global South, but whatever. He has a whole paragraph pretty much on Poland. If I remember correctly, Lin Shu had a discussion of Poland in his preface to Uncle Tom's Cabin, his translation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. What is going on here? This is so fascinating because the way the late Qing is taught, in my experience, is that it's kind of disconnected and it's China just waking up to the rest of the world. But Lu Xun here seems incredibly plugged into what's going on other continents.
Yeah, people were pretty much aware of other continents. They talked about it, and they were aware. I mean, India stood in as a failure in what China shouldn't end up being because of the colonization and the suppression. So it's a cautionary tale. And Poland's kind of the equivalent of India because it's been sort of suppressed by Russia. And it's interesting that in all these essays, Poland and India stand out. He doesn't talk about Hungary so much. I mean, in Mara poetry, he has all sorts of examples of different people, but the two countries he talks about are Poland and India, and they both, what they have in common is a suppression by colonial masters. And so he doesn't get away from the late Qing feeling that if China isn't careful, it's going to be a Wangguo or a doomed country, ending up like India and Poland. To that extent, this obsession shows up in Lu Xun as well, although he doesn't go into it in as much excruciating detail as some others do.
Professor Huters, as we kind of move towards the end, do you have any final thoughts, any last things that you wanted to share, or something we didn't cover?
A word about sort of evolutionary or social Darwinism, which I think to a certain extent you can see in Mara poetry and uneven development, but he very much departs from it here. So it's interesting. Again, he departs from the mainstream of Chinese 20th century thought pretty drastically in sort of not subscribing to the notion that things are evolving in such and such a direction.
Before we wrap up, Lee, I have to give a shout out here because Professor Huters mentioned it earlier. We're working off of a translation of this by John Eugene von Kowallis, John Kowallis for Boundary 2. It is a superb translation of an extremely hard piece to read. When I started reading this, before I found the translation, I remember thinking, I'm not entirely sure I can read this before the interview because it's hard, even if you have some knowledge of the era. So if you're interested in this, absolutely find this because it's well worth a read.
Yes, I agree completely.
Rob, if people want more Chinese literature, where should they go?
Well, we do have our social media platforms. We're on Twitter at ChinLitPod, Instagram at Instagram. I'm going to do that again. It's not Instagram. I've been stumbling like this all day in French and in English, both languages. It's incredible. I'm going to try that again. We are on Twitter at ChinLitPod, Instagram at ChineseLitPod, Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast, and of course, Chinese Literature Podcast at gmail.com. We love emails and we answer emails. So give us a shout, give us a review. Professor Huters, thank you so much for being here and for breaking this incredibly difficult piece down for us.
Thank you.
Well, my pleasure, and I was delighted to be able to go back to it and talk about it.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.